Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry. On today's show, we have Terence Roehrig. Now, Terence is a professor at the US Naval War College and the author of some fascinating research into the Northern Limit Line, the ocean boundary that divides North and South Korea. Now, an awful lot of time and energy gets put into disputes over the DMZ, but in many ways, this sea boundary is a much more fraught issue, much more likely to spark a broader conflict, and as we'll show throughout this podcast, has been witness to some very significant military conflicts already. The Northern Limit Line has its origins in the armistice talks at the end of the Korean War, but it is not a formal part of the armistice. For a number of political reasons, it was important to impose this boundary. In some ways to constrain Sungmun-ri, and of course, importantly, to designate a boundary between the two Koreas so that a new conflict and a new war would never spark again. And though the political situation seemed to have passed them by at the time, this is a boundary in which North Korea felt and still do incredibly hard done by. There was a 3 nautical mile boundary recognized at the time, as was the standard in international law. But North Korea wanted a 12-mile boundary, and that 12-mile boundary has since become the standard operating procedure in other parts of the world. And certainly when you look at a map of the Northern Limit Line, it seems to wrap up around the North Korean peninsula. It doesn't run flat across as you might expect. And of course, at the time, both sides were distracted. The Korean War had just ended. They had to rebuild, solidify their support, build up governments and institutions. But over time, this begins to change. And one of the key reasons for why this becomes a problem is fishing grounds. The Northern Limit Line, in many ways, bars North Korean boats from following the migration patterns and the habitats of seasonal blue crabs, a delicacy at home and an export boon. So in 1977, North Korea expand their territory, and they do so unilaterally. They announce a 200 nautical mile boundary as a special economic zone, and within that, a 50 nautical mile military boundary zone. And by default, the establishment of these zones would negate the Northern Limit Line as it exists. And this begins a trend where North Korea gradually begins to wear away at this line, to denounce its validity, and where South Korea, backed up by America, refused to accept the North's new standards and continue to operate as if the line exists. And from that, you can see how this becomes such a spark, such a problematic place for conflict. And of course, this does erupt in 1999, when the two navies come to blows. And then again in 2002, this time at the height of the World Cup in Seoul. Now, there are various reasons for why these attacks happen and at what times and in what way. There are security reasons, there are political purposes, but what we begin to see is that when North Korea wants to test the resolve of the South, wants to make a point, it does so over these lines. And throughout these conflicts, ships are sunk and sailors die. These are not intimidation exercises. They are not shows of strength. They are literally acts of war. Because at stake here, beyond those fishing grounds, is commercial access to the West Sea, the broader issue of national sovereignty, and a whole plethora of security concerns and defensive liabilities. And though throughout this podcast we will talk through some of the attempts to settle this dispute, the summits that were held, all with pre-echoes for what we are seeing today. In 3 very high-profile events, this all fell about at the end of 2009 and in 2010. 3 incredibly high-profile attacks. The first in which a North Korean vessel was repelled, and then those 2 eye-catching events, the sinking of the SS Cheonan and the shelling of Yongpyeong Island, both of which took the conflict, took the tension to a new level. As Terence will explain, this changed a lot, and there is now commitment inside South Korea that the response in any future attack will be different, will be more forceful, and will not be constrained by political issues. Now, there are a number of ways in which the dispute over this line could possibly be resolved, and Terence talks through them in detail towards the end of our discussion. But what comes through is just how challenging this is, just how deep the dispute is to each country, and the almost intractable positions that both are faced with. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. On that, and to walk us through the history, the conflict, and the future of the Northern Limit Line, this is Terence Roehrig. Terence Roehrig, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you've got an awful lot of research out there. You're one of the experts in the world on the Northern Limit Line. And this is one of those aspects of North Korea which people mention, but they don't know a lot about. The DMZ, the land barrier across the two Koreas, is a lot more popularized. People talk about this a lot more. But you've done an awful lot of work into this sea boundary, this sea border. So I guess as a first question, maybe get you to introduce yourself just a little bit, and then take us to the early origins, which I guess is 1953 and the armistice talks.
Sure. I am a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College and also the director of the Asia Pacific Studies Group there as well. And I do have to give my usual caveat at the start that these are my personal views only and do not represent those of the U.S. government, the Navy, or the Department of Defense. To start with some of the history of the line, it grows out of the armistice talks, where there was discussion about a land boundary, certainly, and that turns out to be the military demarcation line and the DMZ. There was also discussion about a maritime boundary, but the two sides could not agree on a specific line, primarily because the North Koreans were insisting at the time on a 12 nautical mile line, whereas the United Nations Command was holding to a 3 nautical mile line. Now, that may sound a bit like the North Koreans had the right number there, but at the time, 12 nautical miles was not the standard. It was 3 nautical miles. But of course, that is going to change with the Convention on the Law of the Sea agreement, and then 12 nautical miles becomes the standard. But that is going to complicate matters. But so they could not agree on a maritime line, and no one was interested in holding up an armistice agreement and putting a halt to hostilities over the maritime line. And so they concluded an agreement without a maritime boundary. But soon after the armistice was signed, it became clear that there needed to be some sort of a maritime line. And so we have apparently, and I can talk about that as well, on August 30th, the United Nations Command under General Mark Clark promulgated what is known today as the Northern Limit Line, that de facto maritime boundary between North and South Korea.
So an early aspect of this line, and this is one of those fascinating parts of Korean history that often gets missed, early aspect of why this line was so important was South Korean President Sun Mun-ree and fear. And I suppose this fear is, one of the reasons that it becomes such a turbulent moment today, but often from the North, is the idea that if you don't delineate this line, this may become a spark point, a point where there'd be live fire, people will die, and it will become a moment where you can launch into a much larger, broader conflict. So take us to Sun Mun-ree for a second, and just why it was so important to put this line in place for him, or at least to stop him.
Sure. And when these early days after the armistice, certainly the South Korean government did not have much of a navy, but the fishing vessels could stray north, and there was concern that could happen, that might start a broader conflict. There also was a larger concern regarding Syngman Rhee, and he, of course, did not sign the armistice agreement and was unhappy that the end of the war came without the unification of Korea, particularly under his rule. And so there was a great deal of fear that he could restart hostilities with the hope of being able to have the war come to a termination with him in power over the entire Korean peninsula. And so that was some of the concern as well, that this line helped to ensure that there was not going to be some sort of flashpoint between the two Koreas in the West Sea, and as well to make sure that South Korean fishing vessels did not stray north and start some sort of event.
And on the other side of that is Kim Il-sung. So They originally wanted a 12-mile border, and they originally wanted a 12-mile border, and they're getting this 3-mile nautical border off their coastline. But the important thing, I suppose, and one of the key aspects of this northern limit line is that these 5 islands that are now pushed under South Korean control. And I suppose early on, why is it that Kim Il Sung lets this happen? Is he simply distracted, or or does he see this as a reasonable step, at least at the time?
Well, that is one of the interesting stories. The 5 Northwest Islands were in the armistice and were under United Nations command control, and so therefore were given to the UNC, and/or it evolves to South Korean sovereignty. The North Koreans have never challenged the control of those islands, despite, as they would argue later, they are part of or within their territorial sea. When the line is drawn, the North Koreans are never notified of the line. No doubt they figured out fairly soon, although we don't know when, that there was some sort of a line. But they were never told of this line, and that's a key piece to this. One of the things that is of note here is that we don't have a formal challenging of the northern limit line until 1973. When the North Koreans raised the issue in a military armistice commission meeting. And note that these 5 Northwest Islands are in North Korean territorial waters, and henceforth any travel to those islands would require North Korea's permission. There was a great deal of concern in the United States, but also in South Korea as well, that if North Korea chose to enforce this, that we could have some very serious problems. Now, the South Koreans would argue that the fact that it took 20 years for North Korea to first raise the line and to challenge its legitimacy was a sign that North Korea actually accepted the line for these 20 years and is part of an international law concept of acquiescence. And so since the North Koreans had not raised any objection to the line for 20 years, that it in fact showed their acceptance and became part of customary law. There is dispute over that as to whether 20 years would be enough for that, whether the North Koreans, again, knew about this at a particular point. We don't know when, and so how long, that it may actually not have been 20 years that the North Koreans were aware of this line. But I think also that in these early years after the war, Kim Il-sung was likely preoccupied with rebuilding the country. He also had to endure a power struggle as he took the country to the brink of disaster, and no doubt had to struggle to re-cement his power and position in the country after the war. And so it's likely that the Northern Limit Line was probably not that big of a priority for Kim in these early years, but eventually will raise this issue again in a military armistice commission meeting in 1973. And from there on, North Korea will continue to challenge the legitimacy of the line and argue that it is in fact null and void.
So let's build out a couple more of the technical details of this line before we get into some of the meatier conflicts here. In 1968, there is a smaller delineation, a red line limit, a 5-mile limit inside it. And this comes about, I suppose, in many ways, simply to stop conflict, but it comes about maybe because of what was happening on the DMZ or in the broader North-South Korean conflict at the time. The year before, 1967, saw an absolute rise in infiltrations across the DMZ, north to south, something like 550 attacks or 550 infiltrations in the previous year. So take us to this 5-mile red limit inside the Northern Limit Line.
Well, as you know, the late 1960s were a very serious time in North-South relations, in U.S.-North Korean relations, as we have the Pueblo incident, we have the commando raid in Seoul, and multiple cross-border incursions by the North Koreans. And so this was a time of significant tension. and fears that this could perhaps spill over in the maritime zone, certainly again with the Pueblo as part of this, although that was on the East Sea side, that there was a good deal of concern that these issues could spill over. And so an effort to try to keep a greater distance from any particular groups on both sides so that it would not spark some sort of a larger conflict at a time when relations were already tense.
And in 1977, there is two more, I suppose, extra barriers or extra claims put forward by North Korea. One is a 200 nautical mile economic exclusion zone, and one is a 50-mile military boundary zone. So what are these and how legal are these? Because in some ways, at least the 200-mile economic zone reaches out and overlaps in some ways with Chinese claims.
Sure. The 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, that is certainly a legitimate claim to make. States do that, and they will overlap when states are in close proximity. And then it will require some sort of negotiated settlement between the various sides to come up with some delimitation of those competing claims. And those issues have not been settled in the West Sea. South Korea and China, North Korea still have competing claims in regards to the EEZ. The 50 nautical mile military zone is an unusual marker that the North Koreans laid out. It's not entirely clear what this means, what their motive was for it. There is, to my knowledge, precedent for other states that do this. This is a unique North Korea claim, and not entirely sure what this means from a North Korean perspective. It hasn't been a major issue at this particular point, but again, it is a curious claim that the North Koreans made.
And so let's move forward here. As you mentioned, there's a 20-year lull, which of course invokes in some ways this principle that if you don't claim a certain area in a certain time, that this principle of acquiescence, that it becomes yours. But in 1999, as we move forward, there is the first significant clash along the DMZ between South Korean and North Korean naval vessels. So take us to June 15th, 1999, and this clash of these patrol boats around Yongpyeong Island. And of course, Yongpyeong Island is important here, and we're going to get to it later on the podcast. But just for people to keep in mind, this is the island that we're going to be speaking about later on as well.
Sure, and let me take this opportunity to back up once more to 1973, because I think this is an important time as well from a United States perspective. It is interesting when you look at the documents that when North Korea raised this objection, there was a good deal of consternation among U.S. authorities that the northern limit line was in fact on questionable legal ground. There are some interesting documents from the State Department, from a note from Henry Kissinger that raises questions about the legality of the line, that it doesn't rest on solid international law. And so I think the United States already understood some of the question marks about the northern limit line as a legitimate line. But as we move forward to 1999, we have this clash along the northern limit line. And I think it's important to note, as you noted at the start of the podcast, that many people focus on the land border, on the DMZ and the military demarcation line and all that has happened along that area. But I think it's very important to remember that at the maritime boundary, there has been some very serious conflict between North and South Korea. Sailors have died, ships have been sunk, and 1999 is when we have the first major clash between North and South Korea along this line. And again, it was a very serious effort by North Korea to, in this particular case, to challenge the line. Again, there were clashes between North and South Korean vessels, and a very serious reminder of what could happen along this particular maritime front.
And there's a movement here. So what happens at this moment in 1999 is you have fishing vessels crossing the northern limit line, and then following them naval vessels. And this becomes, I suppose, in some ways a trend, and in some ways an explanation for why people are crossing the line. So what is going on when you have these first fishing vessels crossing the line with naval vessels close behind them? And what can we grasp from this? What was Pyongyang's intention? Was this an accidental crossing, or was this in some broader scope a way to test the boundaries in some way?
This particular sequence of events seemed to be a planned strategy of North Korea to test the line. Fishing vessels were a part of that, but also it appears to have been orchestrated to include naval vessels eventually, and so that this was probably a calculated strategy on North Korea's part to test this particular, test the line at this particular point. Your comment about the fishing is very important and well taken. Why do we care about this line? What's important about this? One of the key elements is that this is a very valuable fishing grounds. There are a number of different types of species, but particularly the blue crab, which migrate through this time during the June time period. And so that a time there is a good chance for these kinds of clashes to happen. I might add, currently as well, you can add this the of Chinese fishing vessels, part of this legally and illegally as they cross the northern limit line as well, chasing not only blue crab but other fishing vessels, and that remains a very significant problem for South Korea in managing this area, managing their waters, and a big challenge for their Coast Guard as well.
But this moment was also in many ways, the first major military confrontation since the end of the Korean War, and one which dealt, if not a significant physical blow, despite losing some ships and lots of soldiers, lots of sailors in this incident. North Korea became suddenly very aware that they were outmanned and outgunned by South Korea, despite in some ways having a larger navy.
Some of the differences in technology, particularly firing systems and such on some of these ships, became evident in regards to the naval class. And so it was a wake-up call, if you will, for North Koreans as well, in regards to their naval capabilities and the advancements that the South Koreans had in regards to North Korean naval capacity.
And this is during the Sunshine Policy as well. So something important here, and I suppose this has got a lot of recognition today because in many ways Moon Jae-in is running a Sunshine Policy Mark II, maybe even a little bit further, more advanced than that. This is during the Sunshine Policy. So this is during a moment where South Korea reaches out to North Korea with this idea that first we'll simply engage the North as friends and neighbors, and then talk further down the line about problems with demilitarization, denuclearization, etc. And during this time, we get these first major spikes. So take us to I suppose, just to start things off here, the political situation here at the time, because this was and should have been in many ways an absolute apex in North-South relations.
It was a surprise, and I think many were frankly shocked that in the midst of Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy and some of the progress that was being made there, we aren't far off from summit meeting when Kim travels to Pyongyang, and then North Korea decides to take on an incident like this. It was surprising, and what North Korea's motives were for this are not entirely clear. But certainly, it points to how the North Koreans continue to be unhappy with the northern limit line. Now, what's interesting, this happens in June. Then in September of 1999, the North Korean military makes a very formal statement saying that the line of the current northern limit line was null and void, and instead propose a different line that you can find online very easily. That is an interesting line that is drawn essentially midpoint between the North and South Korean shores, extending out into the West Sea, but with two nautical mile corridors that allow access to the 5 Northwest Islands. When you look at that line, it looks curious. Just the shape of it looks interesting. And whenever I give talks on the Northern Limit Line, and we'll show a PowerPoint slide showing that line, folks will often chuckle, and as a sign of perhaps a curious, odd sort of North Korean effort to redraw this line. But when you look at the line, the general gist of the line, if you exclude the islands for the moment, that line is not far from what you would draw as a line, according to UNCLOS, or the Law of the Sea Treaty, of what's known as a median line, where it is a line that is at a midpoint from the shores of both North Korea and South Korea, that essentially splits the difference of their overlapping EEZ claims and territorial sea claims. So what North Korea drew is actually not far from what two quote-unquote normal states would draw when trying to settle this sort of an overlapping boundary. But of course, the South Koreans are very concerned about the security implications of redrawing that line. And so the North Koreans said, this is the line we will enforce. And you still have these two corridors to reach the 5 islands, and we will enforce that as well. But in the end, the North Koreans chose not to enforce that. And the current, or the Northern Limit Line from 1953 remains actually the de facto boundary between the two.
And that is an important point to mention. I suppose I should have brought it up earlier. I will attach a map to this podcast, because when you look at the Northern Limit Line, it doesn't run as you just mentioned there. It doesn't run as you might expect. It does jut up quite a lot from the south into the north, and you get this idea that the south may be, I suppose, in some ways claiming new territory here. But it's got to do with those islands that you mentioned earlier. But let's move on to June 2002. And this is June 29, and I suppose the important moment to mention here is that it's the Football World Cup, the Soccer World Cup. It's held in South Korea, and South Korea is having the best run they've ever had in this tournament. They're in the third and fourth playoff against Turkey, and you have this clash at just this moment again on across the Northern Limit Line.
Again, another serious reminder of the dangers of a clash along the Northern Limit Line in ways that are very different from what happens or could happen on land. And again, you have sailors being killed and ships being badly damaged. The North Koreans this time took a greater brunt of this particular clash. But again, an effort by the North Koreans to challenge the line and demonstrate that it is not accepting the line. But I think one of the things that is important to recognize here, that the North Koreans, as do other states, when they have disagreements with certain elements of how these lines are drawn, have every right to protest that line, and certainly could have done so diplomatically. But to do so using force is very problematic, despite the fact that, again, the North Koreans may have a claim to argue here. To do so using force across the Northern Limit Line is a mistake and is not helpful, I think, for their case.
And during this moment, a new naval tactic, I suppose it's not new, but it's new in what they were doing, and this is seen in some ways as a development, something they really were trying to build up this idea. And this is North Korean ships both crossing the Northern Limit Line simultaneously, but in entirely different areas at the same time, of course. And this is to divide the respondent ROK, which is the Republic of Korea vessels. So this is in some ways this following had nothing really to do with fishing vessels or ordinary merchant vessels. This was a crossing just by military ships, and done so in a way in which it's very hard to see it in any other way as a actual military naval maneuver.
Yes, I think the South Koreans changed some of their tactics after 1999, And the North Koreans, again, I think this is very clearly a deliberate test on their part to see how the South Koreans would respond to various actions. Not unusual for opposing militaries to do things like this, to test, to see how adversaries respond. And I think that's clearly what happened in this particular case as well.
And there's a moment, so during this attack, a South Korean vessel is sunk, and North Korea claims at this time that the South sunk in northern waters. Of course, this is a disputed border now, and they say that this vessel is now sunk in northern waters, and any salvage operation will have to run through them. So, what were they trying to do here? Was this just another way to enforce the border, or was this I suppose I'm not sure, more of a standard or a military tactic in itself?
Well, I think it is consistent with the North Korean claim that these are their territorial waters. If they will insist on the 12 nautical miles of the sea treaty, then clearly those things would have happened in their territorial waters. And so I think just an effort on their part, again, to insist on that as their claim to this region, even though, again, it ends up not being enforced.
And this does have an important, I suppose, spurring moment for the South Korean Navy. After this, they begin to bulk up not so much their military capacity, their naval capacity, but the way in which their naval capacity is augmented. And they bring in new high-speed patrol boats just for this northern limit line. So tell us about these naval boats and this change of tactic here, because I suppose this is important for listeners to understand and get a good picture in just what we're dealing with here in the northern limit line by understanding what naval boats South Korea realized that they needed to use in such moments.
Sure, and I think I'd like to even back up to a larger issue in regards to South Korean naval development. In the late 90s, South Korea also begins to develop what's called a blue water naval capability, where they build bigger ships and ships that can have ocean-going responsibilities, not purely coastal defense along the South Korean coast dealing with North Korea. And I think there's been some questioning about whether that's truly, that a blue water navy is truly in South Korea's interest and their most important naval priorities. But I think that's an unfair criticism, because in many respects, South Korea has done that blue water navy construction. But it, as you suggested, has also put a lot of effort into building up its coastal vessels. It has built a couple of new classes of coastal patrol vessels. They are much more modern firing systems as well. They are replacing some of their older frigates with a new modern line of those vessels. And so I think South Korea has been doing a lot to try to build up its capabilities for this coastal defense mission, in addition to building some of the vessels that it has for missions farther away from the coast. For example, South Korea participates in the counter-piracy operation off the coast of Eastern Africa as well. And so again, I think South Korea has put a lot of effort into its building up of its navy, and a pretty impressive effort, particularly when you consider that these ships are all built in South Korean shipyards. Some of the weapon systems they have to buy from other sources, but the ships are built in South Korea.
And as we move forward here, I suppose we should flesh out a little bit just what is at stake and what is being and what is so important about the Northern Limit Line. Now, you mentioned earlier fishing, and particularly these blue crab migration patterns. And I suppose in that ways, it's not really a coincidence that the two incidents that we've spoken about happened in early summer, and it's early summer in which it is the perfect season, of course, to try and catch these crabs. But you mentioned Chinese fishing vessels, and then let's touch on that for just a second, because this is important in some ways, because at least from my understanding, it is common practice for North Koreans to accept payment from Chinese fishing boats to enter their waters, and for these Chinese fishing boats to then stray south in many ways causing a diplomatic incident that they didn't see coming.
Yes, and I think that happens from Chinese fishing vessels legally on the North Korean side, but there are also Chinese vessels that are there illegally on the North Korean side and also on the South Korean side. And that has been a big thorn in Chinese-South Korean relations over the last number of years. Some clashes with Chinese fishing vessels in the South Korean Coast Guard. Casualties have resulted from that. The South Koreans and the Chinese have agreements in place to try to regulate fishing, and they are reasonable agreements. The question is whether they are as vigorously enforced on the Chinese side as they need to be. There is just a broader issue in regards to China that they have an increasing demand for protein sources and have largely overfished much of their coastal water, and so increasingly are moving farther and farther into the fishing zones of other countries, and has led them to moving into more and more of the Korean zones. And so that has been a problem in regards to fishing and a rub between China and South Korea. Despite having some of these agreements in place, enforcement has been one of the issues. I might also add that in addition to fishing, there are a number of other things that are in play here as why the Northern Limit Line is important. From the North Korean side, the Northern Limit Line adds a lot of extra time and cost to their vessels leaving their ports on the western side, having to traverse up the Northern Limit Line until they reach its northernmost end before they can turn and come into the Yellow Sea or the West Sea. So that adds a good deal of extra cost and time for North Korean shipping. From a South Korean perspective, there certainly is security that is part of this, that if the Northern Limit Line were adjusted, being able to protect the 5 Northwest Islands would be more challenging. It also might allow for North Korean forces to be able to operate closer to the South Korean shore, because this line would not keep them as far away as they are currently. So there are security issues, there are economic and shipping issues, there are fishing issues that are part of this line, and it's a complicated set of concerns and interests that are part of this. But I would say, just to sort of wrap that point up, that from a South Korean perspective, they will likely not be very willing to adjust the Northern Limit Line, largely based on security concerns, until we see the larger North-South relationship improve for a longer period of time. I think you're likely to see the Northern Limit Line stay where it is for the moment.
So let's touch on that security issue for just a second there. This security issue for South Korea, why is it so important? Is it so important because they recognize those islands as, of course, a sovereign territory of South Korea, and there are populations living on those islands, of course? Is it because they recognize those islands as hard to defend and would be much, much harder, of course, if they lose control over that sea? Or is it simply because North Korean troops and North Korean, I suppose, amphibious landing, which of course is a very highly invested in area of military by the North, these sort of forces would be closer to the opening to the Han River, which of course is right next to Incheon, which is the major airport, and Seoul. So what is the major security concern there? Seoul and the mainland, or is it those islands themselves?
Well, I think it's both. If you look at the line that the North Koreans proposed in 1999, with allowing those 2 nautical mile corridors to the 5 Northwest Islands, if that were the true maritime boundary, it would be very difficult for South Korea to defend these islands if they were ever attacked in any way. Now, certainly over the last year, we have seen a change in the security environment, perhaps between North and South Korea, but I would argue we have a long way to go before this becomes truly a calm, secure security environment. but defending the islands would be more difficult. But also, as you suggest, I'm not convinced that it's about a amphibious operation, but it would be much more difficult to perhaps prevent North Korean special operations forces from being able to infiltrate in the south. And so protecting the South Korean mainland is certainly key, but so are protecting the island. So I think it is both of those issues are a concern from a security standpoint until we would be able to be certain that these areas were safe and secure.
Now, you re-mentioned there something you said earlier about this claim that there should be a 12-mile corridor, sorry, a 2-mile corridor, and that's it, that they can get through here. And you said that South Korea reject this. And this is something that I began to pick up in reading through a lot of your research. It seems as though this is a almost like a cyclical trend here, that at a certain point, North Korea begins to make certain claims, as in the northern limit line is entirely void, or that we now have these corridors. And is it the case that South Korea simply then ignores these and continues on with, I suppose, freedom of navigation exercises and things like this? Or do they in some ways pander to these? Or is this a South Korea, or does South Korea simply step forward and say, no, we're not accepting these lines and continue to operate as normal?
For the most part, South Korea and the United States have ignored North Korean claims and concerned that North Korea might choose to enforce the line, but essentially ignored them. But certainly from time to time, you see possible consideration of looking at the line, either not necessarily changing the line, but the whole joint fishing area or the notion of a maritime peace zone came up in 2007 when Roh Moo-hyun visited North Korea for a summit meeting. You saw it revived again, interestingly, in the Panmunjom Declaration. So there certainly is discussion out there among analysts about what might an altered northern limit line look like. But I think it's unlikely that we are going to get to that, or that that's going to happen anytime soon. We're probably more likely to see some possibility of joint economic development along the line, but that's not going to be easy to do either for a number of reasons.
So you just mentioned there the 2007 summit with Roh Moo-hyun, and this is an extension of Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy. So let's go there for a second, because this, of course, is quite important and has a lot of resonance for today with all the talk of summit meetings and negotiated truces and peace agendas. So in October 2007, there's a summit, and Roh Moo-hyun travels to Pyongyang for the summit. And of course, there's a lot of political controversy around it, just as there is today. But as he goes north, one of the things on the table, though he doesn't want to bring it up, one of the things that is brought up is the northern limit line and this attempt by North Korea to revise this northern limit line. So as you mentioned there are some concessions. I suppose, I'm not sure if concessions is the right word, but there are some changes that South Korea are willing to have, such as joint fishing zones. But my understanding of the summit, despite these small concessions, sort of like maritime establishment zones, etc., South Korea and North Korea hit an impasse over this.
Right. It becomes very difficult when you get to the practical drawing of this line. You had disagreement over whether the line should be an equal division, if you will, or an equal concession of the amount of water that you would allow for fishing. So when you look at this, in many respects, from a North Korean perspective, they would argue they are the ones who have been prevented from fishing in waters that they would argue are their right to be able to fish in. And so it should be the South Koreans that should be giving greater access to waters on their side of the line. But the South Koreans, of course, don't see it that way. And so trying to come up with some sort of box, if you will, that would straddle the northern limit line, that would allow North and South to fish on both sides, becomes difficult to draw. You also look at the possibility that if this joint fishing area allowed South Korean vessels to get closer to the North Korean coast, the North Koreans may not necessarily be so enamored with that possibility as well. So there remains a lot of negotiating and a lot of discussion to see what this joint fishing zone proposal, certainly how it in 2007 showed that this was very difficult. I think it will still be difficult today, but we shall see if the two sides are able to come to an agreement in ways that they weren't able to in 2007.
And No More Young brings forward an idea at this point. He is quite keen to, in some ways, get some traction, because as he's not doing very well in the polls, his party's not doing very well in the polls. And they do come out of this summit, and I suppose this once again has some resonance today, with a declaration of sorts, but it's a vague declaration. And I quote here: to closely work together to put an end to military hostilities, mitigate tensions, and guarantee peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now that could almost be the language that is used today when during some of these summit talks. But No More Young, when he comes back to South Korea and he has a problem of trying to implement that ideal, begins to talk about the difference between a territorial line and a security line. And he begins to say that the Northern Limit Line maybe shouldn't be considered a territorial line in a sense, because it is imposed by America, he claims, and that in South Korean constitution, they have a claim to the entire Korean Peninsula. So he begins to make an argument that it is a security line only. So what do you make of this line of argument? Is there any worth in this, or is he simply making a political point to try and win a political argument here?
Well, I think that you have really two things at work here when you are looking at the Northern Limit Line and some of the language that was used at that time. On the one hand, you have some of the economic issues that we talked about in regards to the line. But the second, perhaps even more important line or aspect is what we've talked about as well with the naval clashes that happened along that line. How can we get this line to be an area of greater peace and stability, in addition to working out some sort of cooperative economic measures? And I think what you are seeing No More Hyun talk about there, as well as folks continue to talk about today, is to what degree is this actually a de facto de facto political boundary versus simply a sort of line of control, if you will. And I think certainly there are many in South Korea that believe this is a de facto military boundary, a de facto political boundary, and need to be held in place until the security situation improves. And it is too risky to alter this line in any other way. So I think that speaks to the security angle of this. The question is, can you possibly have some sort of economic cooperation in that area or along that line that might still preserve that particular part? One of the things that I think is interesting that you have seen come out of the CMA that was signed between the two Koreas, that talks about essentially, I think a way of looking at this is extending the DMZ, if you will, over land, but also to extend it somehow over the maritime zone. And I think that is certainly worth considering, because one of the most important pieces here, again, is how can we keep that area more stable, more secure, and peaceful, so that we don't have a revisiting of the military clashes that we have had in previous years, certainly 2010, 2009, 2002, and 1999 as the major ones.
And that eventually breaks down. Even that agreement on the fishing zone eventually breaks down, and there's no agreement. No More Young and his, I suppose, left-wing leaning coalition loses power, and in comes Lee Mun-bak, a more conservative leader, and this lease talks are scrapped. So before we move on to some of the more recent, these moments in 2009, 2010, you mentioned much earlier about, I suppose we've spoken a lot about South Korea and how they view the line, and North Korea, how they view the line. But you mentioned America and their view on the line, and you said that there's a recognition in some parts of the American administration over the years that this line is not is not legally valid if it's just a normative boundary of sorts. So What is America's view on this? Are they committed to defending this line, or do they see it as something that is a dispute between two countries that they should be left out of? Because this is a tricky one. Ordinarily, you'd leave two countries to figure this out, but in the case of America, they have a joint security pact with South Korea.
I think that the United States, the way to view this is the U.S. has understood that there are some have been queasy about the legal status of the Northern Limit Line, but has been quiet about that and has worked with its South Korean allies to perhaps communicate some of that. But the United States has not been public about saying that, has generally supported the South Koreans in regards to the line publicly. But the South Koreans often will have in the past raised violations of the Northern Limit Line as armistice violations. And the United States has been very clear to say those are not violations of the armistice. Only if North Korean actions violate the territorial waters of the Northwest Islands, then it falls under the armistice. So the United States has played sort of a delicate role in regards to how it has understood the legality of the line while also maintaining support for the alliance, but perhaps most importantly, wanting to make sure that any conflict that happens along the Northern Limit Line does not escalate into a broader conflict. I think, for example, in particular, you see that when the shelling of Yeonpyeong happened in November of 2010, that the United States went to great efforts to try to make sure that South Korea did not retaliate in a way that could escalate the conflict, because, again, that is what U.S. authorities were much more concerned about, that this became a broader, or that it blew up into a major war on the Korean Peninsula.
So let's go there. You mentioned Yeonpyeong Island being shelled. So let's go. That is I suppose, the third in three incidences that happened 2009, 2010. So let's go to 2009 and November. And this incident, I suppose, it became a catalyst for what was going to happen in 2010. And in many ways, it should have been expected that there was a clash along the Northern Limit Line, and a North Korean frigate limps back over the Northern Limit Line, heading home. A number of North Korean sailors killed during this. And it is seen back home as considered as a considerable military defeat for North Korea. So let's take us to that moment there. What happened there, and how should we see this incident in 2009?
Well, I think you described it perfectly in regards to that particular incident. And I think you can view the sinking of the Chonan as North Korea biding its time, deciding that it wanted to retaliate for that November incident, and waited until it felt it had the opportune moment to do that. I think that's probably the best explanation for the sinking of the Chonan.
So let's take us to the sinking of the Chonan. So that's a few months later. That's March 2010. So the SS Chonan is a South Korean naval frigate, and it is sunk by I suppose, expert analysis afterwards says is a North Korean torpedo. The North deny this happened, but where was the Chonan? Was the Chonan south of the Northern Limit Line? Was it inside South Korean territory?
Yes, it was south of the Northern Limit Line. There is, of course, still some doubt in some corners in South Korea that this was in fact a North Korean action that sunk the Chonan, but I think the evidence is very clear that it was likely a North Korean torpedo that sunk the Chonan. And it was viewed again as, I think, as retaliation for the 2009 incident. And the North Koreans were able, well, I should say that the investigation that the South Koreans did, very thorough, that the responsibility of North Korea was not entirely clear until the May report. And in the end, by that time, the South Koreans decided that the proper response was going to be economic and political through the UN. And that fairly good response from the international community for a restrained response to what is essentially an act of war. I mean, when you sink someone's warship, that is a very serious action and an act of war. And South Korea was restrained in its response. But when the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do happens, well, now the South Korean authorities have had enough, and they were ready to retaliate. But the United States talked the South Koreans off the ledge, if you will, and the South ended up not retaliating. But I think a very clear marker said in no certain terms that if the North Koreans do this again, there will be a response. And I think the North Koreans believe them. I think the United States believes them. And I think if the North Koreans do something again, like what happened in 2010, there will be a South Korean response this time.
So let's talk through Yeonpyeong Island a little bit more here. So this is the island that we mentioned earlier. It is shelled later on in that same year, 2010, as you just mentioned there. So what was going on here? It seemed to be the case that there was South Korean military exercises on the island who were shelling, but they were shelling south. So they were doing practice drills, but they weren't shelling anywhere near the northern border. They were shelling south. And this is my understanding, from a separate island across the northern limit line, North Korean forces begin to literally shell the island. And this island is, of course, has military personnel on it for the training exercises, but also a civilian population. And civilians are killed during this action. So let's take us there for a moment. What happened on this day?
Well, as you mentioned, the South Koreans were conducting a routine artillery exercise that they have done on a number of different occasions, firing shells towards the south. North Koreans had warned them not to do it. And the South Koreans, as you would expect, did not decide to suspend the exercises as a result and did it regardless. And the North Koreans decided this time to open up on Yeonpyeong-do. 2 Marines were killed, 2 civilians were killed. In the resulting investigation, there certainly were concerns raised about the readiness of South Korean forces on the islands and the state of some of its artillery batteries to be able to retaliate, and led to some changes in the command structure in the artillery pieces that were there. And so raised some important questions that the South Koreans needed to confront in regards to their response, but have done that. And again, I would take very seriously the South Korean threat that if the North Koreans would conduct something similar, this time they would respond.
And there's another actor in all this, and we've left them out a little bit so far, apart from illegal fishing boats, and that's China. So we've spoken through North Korea, South Korea, and America and how they view this northern limit line. We haven't mentioned China yet, so let's do that. It seems to be a lot of the reporting on China. Of course, people over-report just how friendly these two countries are. It's not really that case. But one of the things that seems to be true is that the main import from China is that they want stability on the peninsula. Yet this northern limit line is one of those areas where over the years, as we've mentioned through numerous live fire incidents, that there is no stability and there's a risk of broader conflict. So how does China view what has been happening over this northern limit line and the future of this line?
I think you're absolutely right about Chinese concerns being first and foremost about stability. But they haven't said much about the northern limit line per se, other than when some of these incidents happen, they will generally weigh in and ask for calm and stability on all sides. But the Chinese have not said much about any argument that they have made in regards to the legality of the line or a future proposal in regards to how the line should be dealt with. The Chinese have been relatively quiet about it, other than being concerned when these incidents happen that they too are not interested in seeing this spiral into any sort of a larger conflict.
So let's move forward here and look towards some sort of resolution or some sort of end to the clashes, or at least a amicable solution here. So through a lot of your research, you mentioned some of the scenarios for how we can come around to a dispute, to a settlement to this dispute. And of course, the first one that needs mentioning is military force. So How likely is this? It seems to be the case that North Korea has an incredibly large navy, but not very well advanced. As you mentioned, it's a brown water navy, and South Korea has a much more advanced navy, but a little bit smaller, but has American backing. But in many ways, this seems like a fool's errand here. It's not going to be in anyone's interest to push this forward, to try and end the dispute over the northern limit line by military force. Or do you see this as, in some ways, an option? Or do you see it as something that the North may see as an option, even if it's not viable?
I think it's unlikely. I think, as you suggest, that the North Korean Navy would not be able to pull this off, and they would be in a world of hurt if they tried to do this. Now, certainly they can cause damage in some early opening rounds, but their Navy is not strong enough to compete against the South Korean Navy, despite having a lot of ships and certainly a lot of submarines as well. But I think it's just highly unlikely for the North Koreans to push this in any sort of military scenario. So I think that's unlikely. Certainly, given the current status we are in, I think it is going to be likely a relatively calm border for the moment. That certainly wasn't the case a year or so ago, but I think it's likely to stay that way at this particular point. I think the bigger question is, what is any sort of long-term solution to this line as from what it is currently? Certainly, one of the other interesting elements of this is that when you look at North and South Korea, again, as I mentioned earlier, they aren't really two quote-unquote normal states. They are two countries that both argue that they have sovereignty over the entire peninsula, and their constitutions reflect that. And so in some respects, this northern limit line is an internal boundary. And so once the two Koreas are united in some shape or form, this line would go away. But I think we're a long way from any sort of reunification. But that adds a very unique twist to the line. I think you are much more likely to see the line stay in place as it is. Elements to try to either demilitarize the zone, to perhaps have some sort of maritime demilitarized zone where naval vessels are pulled back from the line to avoid clashes and have it be much more of a Coast Guard patrolled sort of area. You might have the line adjusted in the middle between, again, if you look at a map, in the northwest, the farthest northwest are 3 of the islands, and closer to Seoul and the Han River are 2 of the islands. So there's a fairly large space between those. There is a proposal that floats around where you might extend the northern limit line farther out in that area to allow still South Korea would have access to the 5 islands, but the North Koreans would have a bit more access to the fishing ground in that area. You might also allow some ability of North Korean vessels to not have to go up to the northwest and out and around to get into the West Sea, and instead have some corridors across the northern limit line where they could traverse more directly into the shipping lanes. That might be another proposal. But all of these things remain to be seen in regards to the next months and years ahead. I think one of the key pieces here is all of these things may ultimately be tied to North Korean denuclearization. And if there continues to be any sort of progress, or perhaps more to the point, hope that there could be progress, then maybe we will have some movement on the northern limit line in a very incremental way. Again, not necessarily moving the line, but perhaps allowing North Korean access or joint fishing, et cetera, et cetera. But the question, the crucial question is, if denuclearization clearly becomes not possible and relations return to some degree of hostility, then all of these things are going to be off the table, perhaps, and then I don't know where we're going to go with them.
So am I right in reading you there that you think the only way really forward here is through step-by-step confidence building measures where you move forward little bit by little bit, and then a negotiated settlement at some point between the two states themselves? Because there is one other option out there, but it is, I suppose, in many ways a little bit fraught, and that is formal adjudication, which is the International Court of Justice. But North Korea are not signed up to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So do you see this as something that's going to have to be formally brought about simply between the two Koreas, or is there any chance of an international end to this sort of process as well?
I think it's going to have to be between the two Koreas. South Korea will not let this go to international arbitration. I don't think they would feel that that is in their interest to do so. There are too many security issues at stake here. I think the international law elements of this are interesting in that I don't think the North Koreans would necessarily get everything they have claimed they want from their proposals about a altered northern limit line, but neither would South Korea, and there would be some sort of splitting of the difference, no doubt, that would also take into account some of South Korea's concerns. But I think it's highly unlikely at this point that the South Korean government would be willing to take this to any sort of international arbitration.
So that is probably a good look forward and a good moment to end this podcast on. So this has been a fascinating walkthrough, a incredibly well-researched area of history. Not many people have done it. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. So Terence Roehrig, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
My pleasure, Jed. Thanks for having me.